They say a coward dies many times before his death, but for a Soviet soldier during World War II, death was often instant and inescapable. Imagine being a soldier on the front lines, facing the relentless advance of the Nazi war machine. Retreating, even to save your own life, would mean exclusion by your own comrades. This was the reality for Soviet soldiers under Stalin's infamous Order Number 227, a policy so brutal it became known as not a step back. Let's explore one of Stalin's most infamous wartime orders, issued at a moment of utter desperation during World War II. Order Number 227 banned any retreat under the threat of execution, turning the Red Army into a force driven by fear as much as by patriotism. Join us as we unravel the motivations behind this policy, its brutal enforcement, and the devastating toll it took on the soldiers who lived or died under its shadow. The summer of 1942 marked a critical turning point in World War II. Nazi Germany's Operation Barbarossa had plunged deep into Soviet territory, leaving entire cities like Kiev and Sevastopol in ruins. Soviet forces, already outmatched and under-equipped, were retreating in droves. Stalin, watching his army crumble, knew he had to act. But his solution wasn't to inspire or motivate, it was to terrorize. On July 28, 1942, Stalin issued Order Number 227, famously declaring, "Not one step back." To Stalin, retreat was synonymous with cowardice and betrayal. He believed that victory could only be achieved by eliminating what he called panic mongers and cowards within the ranks of his army. The order wasn't just a rallying cry, it was a death sentence for anyone who faltered. It signaled the beginning of one of the harshest discipline policies in modern military history. To Stalin, the war wasn't just about territory, it was about unwavering loyalty and submission to the Soviet cause, and he was willing to use terror to enforce it. The implementation of Order Number 227 brought unspeakable horrors to the front lines, transforming the Red Army into a force driven as much by fear of its own leadership as by the enemy. The order's enforcement was as systematic as it was merciless, and it left an unforgettable mark on the soldiers who lived and died under its shadow. At the heart of the Order Number 227's enforcement were the blocking detachments, units specifically tasked with preventing retreat at any cost. These detachments were positioned behind advancing Soviet troops, with the sole purpose of shooting anyone who attempted to flee without explicit orders. Survivors' accounts paint a chilling picture of their ruthlessness. Soldiers who hesitated, panicked, or even fell back under overwhelming enemy fire were gunned down. One harrowing story tells of a young soldier who retreated after his rifle jammed during an assault. He was dragged back by a blocking detachment, subjected to a summary court-martial, and executed in front of his comrades as a grim warning to others. Penal units were highly paid and received special pension benefits for their unpleasant and sometimes dangerous work. During the war, some units achieved considerable fame. The psychological impact of these detachments was devastating. Soldiers knew that retreat, even for valid reasons, meant certain death. This created an atmosphere of paralyzing fear, where men were forced to choose between facing the enemy's bullets or their own comrades. As one veteran later recalled, "We weren't just fighting the Germans, we were fighting our own fear, our own leaders." Death was everywhere, in front of us, behind us, even within us. What if I told you that even Stalin's son was a victim of Soviet discipline? Most people don't know that Stalin's son, Yakov Zhugashvili, fell victim to the brutal discipline of the Red Army. Captured by the Germans in 1941, Yakov was reportedly disowned by his father, who refused to negotiate his release. While this happened before Order Number 227, it reflected the same merciless ideology that Stalin later imposed on his entire army. Yakov eventually died in a German concentration camp. Some say by suicide, others claim he was executed. Either way, even being Stalin's son didn't guarantee survival in his ruthless system. Even generals were not safe. Stalin's paranoia didn't just affect low-ranking soldiers. High-ranking officers were also constantly at risk. Generals who failed to hold their positions were accused of cowardice, removed from command, and sometimes executed. In some cases, officers who were simply unlucky in battle found themselves facing Stalin's wrath. One chilling example is General Dmitry Pavlov, commander of the Western Front, who was blamed for Soviet defeats in 1941 and executed as a traitor. Order number 227 made it clear failure was not an option, even for those at the top. They had punishment camps for civilians too. Stalin extended his iron grip to civilians living in Nazi-occupied areas. Those suspected of collaborating with the enemy, even if they had no choice, were labeled traitors. Many were sent to the dreaded Gulag prison camps, where they faced starvation, disease, and brutal forced labor. Entire families were punished for the supposed crimes of a single person. To Stalin, there was no such thing as neutrality. Either you fought for the Soviet Union, or you were its enemy. For those who survived the initial enforcement of Order number 227, there was another layer of horror: the Penal Battalions, or Strafbots. These units were composed of soldiers and officers deemed guilty of cowardice, disobedience, or other infractions. Stripped of their ranks and rights, they were sent on the most dangerous missions imaginable, clearing minefields by walking through them, charging at heavily fortified German positions with little to no support, and serving as cannon fodder to distract the enemy were common tasks. Survival in these units was rare, and the men knew it. What's even crazier, if they somehow survived, they could regain their honor and be reintegrated into regular units. It was basically a death sentence with a slim, cruel hope of redemption. One survivor of a penal battalion described it as a death sentence with a delay. He recounted how his unit was ordered to storm a German machine gun nest with nothing but rifles and a few grenades. "We knew we wouldn't make it," he said, "but what choice did we have? If we refused, we'd be shot. If we ran, we'd be shot. So we charged, and most of us died." While blocking detachments were notorious for shooting retreating soldiers, there were rare moments when the tide turned against them. In some desperate situations, enraged troops fought back, refusing to be slaughtered by their own side. There are reports of entire units mutinying, with soldiers turning their guns on the political officers who enforced Order number 227. While these acts of defiance were brutally suppressed, they serve as haunting reminders of the desperation and chaos the order created. If you watched the video up until this moment, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with fellow history enthusiasts. The human toll of Order number 227 is difficult to comprehend. For every man who died, countless others carried the scars, physical and psychological, of living under such a regime. Historians estimate that between 1941 and 1945, the Soviet military executed approximately 158,000 soldiers for desertion, cowardice, or other offenses, with a significant portion of these executions occurring after the implementation of Order number 227. Additionally, the penal battalions, or Strafbots, which were filled with soldiers accused of violating the order, suffered staggering casualty rates, with some units experiencing 90% or higher mortality rates during their missions. These numbers only scratch the surface of the order's devastating impact, as they do not account for the countless soldiers who died in combat under the threat of execution, or the psychological trauma inflicted on survivors. The enforcement of Order number 227 placed soldiers and commanders in impossible moral dilemmas. Imagine being a commander ordered to execute one of your own men for retreating, knowing that the retreat might have been the only way to survive. Imagine being a soldier forced to turn your rifle on a comrade who stumbled back under enemy fire, only to realize that you might be next. These agonizing choices tore at the fabric of the Red Army, creating an environment of mistrust and despair. One veteran later recounted, "We weren't fighting for our country anymore. We were fighting to survive for just one more day, knowing that death could come from any direction." The sense of betrayal, being treated as expendable by their own government, stayed with many soldiers long after the war ended. But at what cost? The human suffering it inflicted on soldiers, commanders, and their families has left a lasting stain on its legacy. Today it's remembered as a grim example of how totalitarian regimes prioritize victory over humanity, using fear and violence to achieve their goals. Stalin's not a step back policy may have saved the Soviet Union, but it also symbolizes the devastating price of his unyielding quest for power. What do you think? Was Stalin's order a necessary evil or an unforgivable atrocity? Let us know in the comments. If you found the story meaningful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with fellow history enthusiasts. And join us next time for another deep dive into the stories history left behind. Thanks for watching before now. See you next time.